In the winter of 1937, the valley known as Dead Hollow lay buried beneath a silence that stretched deeper than the snow. The hills of Appalachia have always carried whispers of curses and secrets, but no tale clung as tightly as that of Margaret O'Dell, a widow who lived at the end of a forgotten trail. Her cabin leaned into the mountain like a weary soul, its wood eaten by time, its windows smeared with the soot of years. Inside, 4 children moved quietly through shadows, each marked by features that set them apart from any other family in the county. Their faces bore the unmistakable ridges of hidden bloodlines, their eyes too close, their foreheads shaped in ways the neighbors could never explain. To Margaret, they were her blessings and her burdens, living proof of a story she refused to tell. The town below had long since abandoned her. Children in the schoolyard whispered that the O'Dell brood carried the devil's touch. Men at the mill spit tobacco and swore she had chosen her isolation, that no decent folk should ever climb the mountain to her door. Yet the truth was more complex, stitched into Margaret's life like the seams of a patched quilt. She had been left a widow too young, her husband buried before their first child's 2nd birthday. Alone, without kin, she retreated into the hollow, where the forest grew so thick the sun struggled to reach the ground. There, far from the eyes of the town, her family line took turns it was never meant to take. By the time the youngest, Samuel, was born, his small jaw slanted in a way that made breathing laborious. Margaret cradled him with a devotion bordering on despair, rocking him through nights that seemed eternal. She told the other children it was God's will, that their faces were reminders of his mysterious plan. Yet when she spoke those words aloud, her voice trembled, as if she feared the walls themselves might accuse her of lying. Neighbors who passed along the ridge at dusk sometimes caught glimpses of the children, pale figures peering from the tree line, eyes glinting in the half-light, hair uncombed, movements strangely synchronized. Rumors thickened like fog. Some said they were not children at all, but phantoms of the valley, spirits bound to their mother's grief. Others whispered that Margaret had welcomed forbidden unions into her home, and the children's deformities were not divine marks, but the result of bloodline bonds kept secret in the dark. Margaret carried on as if deaf to the whispers. Each morning, smoke rose from her chimney, proof she was still keeping the children alive on cornbread and beans, on roots pulled from frozen earth. But behind her silence was an ever-growing fear. Samuel had begun to cough, his throat raw, his breath rattling. She pressed her ear to his chest at night and heard a rattle that seemed to echo from the mountains themselves. The sound haunted her more than the judgment of neighbors, more than the endless hunger her family endured. It was a sound she could not pray away. Samuel's eyes glazed with fever, his lips cracked, his frail body trembling in her arms. In the cold stillness of Dead Hollow, illness was a sentence rarely reversed. Margaret, who had always kept her family hidden, now found herself trapped in the torment of choice. Continue the silence that had protected them, or summon help from a world that despised them. For days she hesitated. She brewed teas of pine needles, crushed herbs gathered from the frozen ground, pressed warm cloths against his chest. But Samuel's cough grew sharper, tearing at him as though his lungs were splintering. The older children watched with wide eyes, their own strange features twisted in fear. They whispered to each other at night when Margaret thought they slept, wondering if Samuel's soul would be taken by the hollow before spring. Margaret's mind replayed the voices of the townsfolk, calling her cursed, unholy, a woman who had turned her back on decency. To go down the mountain meant to face them, to endure their eyes lingering too long on the children's faces. Yet the thought of Samuel's small body growing cold in her arms was a weight she could no longer bear. She wrapped him in a worn blanket, tied her shawl tight against the wind, and prepared for the walk down the trail. When she reached the ridge, she paused. The valley spread before her, distant chimneys smoking, the faint sound of dogs echoing in the hills. She knew every step toward town would invite questions, whispers, condemnation, but she also knew it might mean life for her child. So she pressed forward, her boots crunching against frozen earth, her breath rising in white clouds. The doctor, a man named Andrew Whitlock, had not seen Margaret in more than a decade. When she appeared at his door, her face lined with years of solitude, carrying a child whose eyes bulged slightly from a malformed brow, his reaction was a mixture of shock and professional urgency. He examined Samuel quickly, his voice low and grave. Diphtheria. The disease was spreading fast across rural counties, and without treatment, the boy would suffocate. As Dr. Whitlock prepared his instruments, he studied Margaret. His gaze flickered to the child's face, then back to hers, a silent question forming behind his eyes. How had 4 children come to share such unmistakable traits? Margaret tightened her grip on Samuel, avoiding his stare. She whispered only 3 words, words she had repeated like a prayer for years. "It's God's burden." But for the first time, her words did not settle the air. Instead, they raised suspicion. If you want to follow more hidden cases that reveal dark truths, don't forget to subscribe. That suspicion settled deep in Dr. Whitlock's mind as he worked swiftly to save Samuel's life. He had treated children across the mountain valleys, seen malnutrition and deformities born of poverty, but never the same peculiar shape of face repeated so distinctly in siblings. When he placed the breathing tube and watched Samuel's chest struggle but finally rise, he felt both relief and unease. The child might survive the diphtheria, but there was a different sickness lingering in this family, one that no medicine could cure. Whitlock questioned Margaret gently, asking about Samuel's father, about kin who might be informed. Each time her eyes narrowed and her lips pressed shut. She deflected with scripture, with vague words about hardship and providence. Yet beneath her silence, he detected the tremor of a woman carrying too many secrets. When the boy's breathing steadied, Whitlock stepped back, wiping his hands, and whispered to his assistant that the case was unlike any he had ever seen. The assistant, a young man named Hal Peterson, later recalled that moment. In his journal, he wrote that the children's faces were eerily uniform, as though stamped from the same fragile mold. Those words would resurface decades later when historians pieced together the story of Dead Hollow. But in that cold examination room of 1937, they were nothing more than private observations, the kind that gnawed silently at Whitlock's conscience. Determined to understand, Whitlock reached for the county records, thick ledgers stored in the courthouse basement. He spent hours after dark tracing the O'Dell name backward. The same surnames tangled and reappeared, marriages between cousins, bonds between families who never strayed from the hollow. The deeper he searched, the clearer it became. Margaret's children were not afflicted by divine punishment, but by generations of confined unions. What the townspeople had whispered in half-truths was recorded in plain ink across decades of records. The revelation weighed heavily on him. As a man of medicine, he knew the consequences: craniofacial deformities, fragile health, shortened lives. As a man of his time, he also knew exposing Margaret could bring ridicule, perhaps worse, from a community eager to brand her family as monstrous. He carried the truth in silence, unsure whether compassion meant keeping the secret or revealing it. Meanwhile, Margaret returned to her cabin with Samuel in her arms. The other children rushed to her, their eyes darting anxiously toward their brother's pale face. For a brief moment there was relief, even joy that he had survived. But Margaret's own eyes betrayed her. She had seen the look in Whitlock's face, the way he lingered on her children's features. She understood that their fragile safety was slipping, that their world of secrecy was unraveling thread by thread. Yet Margaret clung to the hope that the mountain might swallow their story again, as it had so many times before. She told herself that Dr. Whitlock was a man of discretion, that he would not trouble himself with the lives of a widow and her strange children. But the hills have a way of carrying whispers farther than any intention. Within weeks, fragments of the truth reached the town. At the mill, a rumor began. Margaret's children were not victims of sickness, but of her own sins. Some swore Whitlock had confided in a preacher, while others claimed he had spoken carelessly to the county clerk. In truth, Whitlock had told no one beyond his assistant, but gossip is seldom concerned with accuracy. By spring, stories about the O'Dell family had grown grotesque, painting Margaret as a woman who had consorted with spirits in Dead Hollow, giving birth to children neither fully human nor fully damned. One neighbor, a woman named Ruth Talley, added fuel to the fire. She claimed she had once seen a tall, shadowy man standing at Margaret's cabin long after her husband's death, a figure who vanished into the woods when spotted. Ruth insisted this was proof of Margaret's dealings with unholy forces. The townsfolk seized on her tale, repeating it until it hardened into supposed fact. To them, the deformities of the children were no longer signs of hidden bloodlines, but evidence of a curse placed upon the widow. The false lead spread so quickly that even some of Margaret's few sympathizers began to turn away. Farmers who once traded flour and beans at her door now avoided the path to her cabin. Mothers kept their children closer, whispering that the O'Dell brood carried darkness in their bones. By the summer of 1937, Margaret was more alone than ever, her isolation enforced not only by geography but by fear. Inside the cabin, the children felt the shift. They asked their mother why people crossed themselves when they passed on the ridge, why stones appeared on their doorstep at night, why the preacher's voice carried louder when he condemned sinners from the pulpit. Margaret answered with silence, her lips tight, her eyes fixed on the fire. She could endure their hatred, but she knew it was only a matter of time before their suspicion pressed harder, demanding explanations she could not give. The town believed a phantom haunted her hollow. Margaret knew the truth was far closer and far more dangerous. She had lived with it for years, pressed beneath the weight of silence and survival. The children's faces mirrored not only one another but also the long-forgotten faces in her family's past. Generations of kin who never left Dead Hollow had folded back upon themselves, binding the O'Dell bloodline in ways that time could not erase. It was not phantoms or curses that marked them, but choices made behind closed doors, choices Margaret both inherited and endured. The strain of carrying that secret etched itself into her body. Her hands trembled when she chopped firewood. Her breath shortened even when the air was clear. She often stared at her reflection in a pan of water, wondering if her own face carried the marks she saw in her children. When Samuel's illness faded and his breathing steadied, she prayed with renewed desperation, though her prayers sounded less like faith and more like bargains whispered to an unhearing sky. It was during one of those weary days that Dr. Whitlock returned. He brought medicine under the guise of routine, though his true purpose was less simple. He had spent weeks balancing the duty of a physician with the burden of his discovery. At last, unable to carry it alone, he sought the counsel of a colleague, an older physician from Lexington who specialized in hereditary conditions. Whitlock did not name Margaret, but he described the features, the clustering of deformities, the records he had studied. The colleague answered with words that chilled him. "This is not God's punishment. It is the collapse of a lineage confined too long." When Whitlock stood again in Margaret's cabin, the fire throwing pale light against the children's faces, he tried to offer gentleness. He explained that their ailments were not curses but illnesses of the blood, consequences of kinship repeated over generations. Margaret listened, her face rigid, her jaw clenched. The children sat in silence, wide-eyed, not comprehending the words, but sensing the weight behind them. Finally, Margaret rose. She placed her hands flat on the table, her voice sharp with both defiance and despair. "You think you know our sins, but you don't know what it means to be left here, with no one but the hollow to answer your hunger." Her words cracked as though pulled from the deepest chamber of her grief. For Whitlock, it was both confession and warning. He knew then that Margaret would never betray her own blood, never expose the truth in daylight. Yet he also understood that silence could not hold forever. Disease, deformity, and rumor had already begun to speak for her. In the hollows of Appalachia, whispers traveled faster than truth, and by 1938, the O'Dell family was no longer just a household hidden in the mountains. They had become a legend of shame. Children in town dared each other to walk near the trail that led up to Margaret's cabin, as if the earth itself there was cursed. At church, the preacher's words grew sharper, sermons bent toward unnamed sins that everyone understood pointed to her family. But the heaviest blow did not come from the pulpit or from the mouths of neighbors. It came from within her own bloodline. One evening, her eldest daughter, Clara, asked questions Margaret had long feared. Clara's face, marked with the same distinctive ridges, tightened as she spoke. "Mama, why do we look alike? Why do they all say we are not right?" The question lingered in the cabin like smoke, thick and suffocating. Margaret, who had endured years of silence, found herself speechless. She turned away, her hands trembling as she stirred the pot on the fire, though it was already boiling. Clara's words were the crack in the dam. The children had begun to see what Margaret prayed they never would, that their reflections carried a story beyond simple misfortune. Their questions sharpened, their whispers grew louder at night. Margaret could not keep them blind forever. That same winter, Dr. Whitlock confided his unease to a county social worker named Evelyn Hart. She was a stern woman with a reputation for cutting through excuses, but she also carried a deep sympathy for children born into hardship. When she heard of the O'Dell case, she insisted on climbing the hollow herself. Her notes, preserved decades later, describe the visit in chilling clarity. The children appeared bonded not only by kinship, but by something heavier, a silence that seemed forced upon them. Their deformities were unmistakable. This is not coincidence. This is inheritance. Margaret met her at the door with a look that could cut stone. She allowed Hart to enter, but every word was strained. Evelyn asked questions about family, about lineage, about the fatherless births. And each answer was a wall, a refusal. Still, Evelyn was no fool. She studied the children's faces, their mirrored features, their strange hesitance when speaking. The truth was unspoken but laid bare in front of her. When Evelyn descended the mountain that evening, she carried more than observations. She carried the certainty that the O'Dell case would not remain hidden much longer. Her notes would become evidence, her testimony a wedge between Margaret and the fragile silence she had guarded for so long. By the spring of 1938, that wedge was already splitting the hollow open. Evelyn Hart's report to the county authorities painted the O'Dell family as victims of generational confinement, children born under the heavy shadow of hidden unions. It was not written with cruelty, but its words carried the weight of judgment, and in a town hungry for scandal, it was received as confirmation of every whispered suspicion. The sheriff, a man named Clyde Hatfield, was tasked with visiting the cabin. He had grown up in the same ridges and hollows, and though hardened by years of law enforcement, he felt unease as he ascended the narrow trail. Later, he would confess that the silence around Margaret's cabin felt different, less like solitude, more like an invisible presence pressing against him. When he entered, the children stood in a row, staring at him with wide, unblinking eyes. Their resemblance to one another was so stark, it unsettled even his seasoned composure. Margaret spoke little. She offered bread, water, and nothing more. Hatfield tried to question her gently, but every inquiry about kin, about fathers, about the children's future was met with deflection. She repeated the same phrase, steady but strained. "They are mine, and God will decide their path." Hatfield returned to town uneasy, but heart was relentless. She demanded intervention, claiming the children's welfare was at stake. Yet in the court of public opinion, her words twisted. Instead of compassion, the townsfolk spoke of shame and sin. The O'Dell cabin became a point of morbid fascination, a cursed landmark. Boys threw stones from the ridge, daring each other to shout insults into the valley. Women clutched their children tighter if Margaret dared to appear at the market. Then an unexpected voice entered the debate. Reverend Silas Moore, an old preacher with a reputation for severity, shocked the town when he declared from the pulpit that the O'Dell children were not monsters but the wages of secrecy. He warned that the sin was not theirs but the burden of a community that had turned its back on them. His words unsettled the congregation. Some dismissed him as soft in his old age, but others carried his sermon like a thorn in their conscience. Margaret never attended church to hear his defense. She sat in her cabin that Sunday, rocking Samuel, staring into the fire, yet she felt the change in the air. The hollow was no longer just her refuge, it was becoming her prison, one whose walls were closing in with each passing rumor and each new pair of eyes fixed on her door. By the summer of 1939, Dead Hollow felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage that Margaret could not escape. The children no longer roamed freely along the ridges. Every outing risked stones, curses, or the eyes of men who came not to offer help but to watch. Margaret barred the door at night, listening to footsteps crunch the leaves outside, the laughter of boys daring one another to come close. The county finally acted. Evelyn Hart returned with a deputy, this time carrying an official order to examine the family's welfare. The moment she stepped into the cabin, the children shrank into corners, their eyes darting nervously between their mother and the strangers. Hart spoke softly, assuring them she meant no harm, but the air inside the cabin was heavy, suffocating as though every word pressed against an invisible wall of secrecy. Margaret stood firm, refusing to allow her children to be taken, her voice trembling but unyielding. "They are mine. Their blood is mine. You will not cut us apart." The deputy, unused to such defiance from a mountain widow, hesitated, but Hart persisted, documenting every detail, the children's identical deformities, their withdrawn behavior, the absence of schooling, the lack of contact with the outside world. Her notes became a case file, one that soon landed on the desk of the county judge. The judge, Thomas Redfield, was known for his sternness, but also his practicality. He faced a choice: remove the children and risk shattering what little family they had, or allow them to remain in a hollow that seemed to breed both illness and secrecy. Redfield called for a hearing, but it was conducted quietly behind closed doors. The town gossiped of charges, of trials, of Margaret's supposed confession. The truth was more restrained. The court declared Margaret unfit for full guardianship, yet allowed her to keep the children under periodic supervision. It was a compromise that satisfied no one. Some in town called it too lenient, arguing the children should be taken away entirely. Others condemned it as cruel, a punishment for a woman already broken by widowhood and poverty. For Margaret, the ruling was both a reprieve and a sentence. She kept her children, but she knew now that strangers would always be watching, always waiting to intrude. The verdict did not silence the valley, it only deepened its unease. Neighbors still avoided the trail, whispers still grew in the market, and every knock at the cabin door sent fear through Margaret's chest. The law had spoken, but the curse of Dead Hollow was far from lifted. Even after the judge's quiet ruling, the valley remained restless. Margaret lived under constant inspection, each visit from the county stripping another layer of her dignity. Evelyn Hart returned every few months, sometimes with a doctor, sometimes with a deputy. Each time she noted the children's conditions, their frail bones, their mirrored deformities, and the mother's unrelenting grip upon them. To Margaret, these visits felt less like help and more like intrusions. She had built her life on silence, and silence was all she had left. Yet the children began to change beneath the pressure. Clara, the eldest, grew bolder, her questions sharper. She asked why the family never left the hollow, why they were different, why their blood felt like a secret. Margaret silenced her with a glance, but the girl's eyes no longer held the blind trust of childhood. Meanwhile, Dr. Whitlock struggled with his own conscience. He had sworn to heal, not to condemn, but he could not ignore what was unfolding. In a private letter to a geneticist at the university, he described the O'Dell family in clinical terms. These children bear the marks of repeated confined unions, their features etched by generations. They live not by choice, but by inheritance. That letter, though meant for science, became a spark. Years later, it would be cited in medical journals as one of Appalachia's most haunting cases. The townspeople, however, cared little for science. To them, the O'Dells remained a spectacle of shame. Children still threw stones, men still whispered about curses, women still prayed the widow's brood would never mingle with their own bloodlines. Justice, as they saw it, had not been served. The county's decision to leave the children with Margaret was viewed as weakness, and resentment festered in silence. For Margaret, the greatest blow was not the gossip or the judgment. It was the quiet withdrawal of her children. Samuel, once clinging to her arms, now sat alone, staring into the fire as though he could see beyond the flames. Clara whispered with her brothers when they thought their mother slept. Their bond with one another grew stronger, while their bond with Margaret frayed. She felt the hollow walls closing in, not just from neighbors or courts, but from within her own home. The curse of Dead Hollow was no longer just a story told in town. It had become a truth her children were beginning to believe, a legacy they could not escape. By the early 1940s, Dead Hollow was no longer merely a remote valley in Appalachia. It had become a name carried with dread, a place parents warned their children never to wander. Margaret's family still remained in their leaning cabin, but time had stripped it of warmth. The boards sagged, the roof leaked, and the smoke that once rose daily from its chimney thinned as hunger gnawed deeper. Clara, on the brink of womanhood, had grown restless. She spoke less to her mother and more to her brothers, whispering plans of leaving the hollow. The others listened, their eyes bright with the first glimmers of defiance. Margaret sensed it, though none dared say it aloud. She had fought for years to hold them close, but the stronger her grip, the further they seemed to drift. The county continued its visits, though by then they had little effect. Evelyn Hart grew older, her notes filled with resignation. She wrote that the O'Dell children were creatures of the hollow, bound by both blood and burden, unlikely to find peace beyond these mountains. Her reports became fewer, her trips less frequent, until one day she simply stopped coming. The law had placed its mark, but the hollow had swallowed its will. In town, the O'Dells were remembered less as people and more as legend. Whispers of the widow's children wove themselves into fireside tales of a family cursed, of faces too alike, of voices echoing in the woods at night. Children grew up hearing the name Dead Hollow as if it were a warning, a place where silence still reigned and bloodlines folded inward until they collapsed. Margaret herself faded with little notice. Some said she died in her cabin, her children burying her in an unmarked grave near the tree line. Others claimed she wandered into the forest one winter and never returned, her shawl found snagged on a branch come spring. However she passed, no preacher spoke over her, no townsfolk attended her end. The children scattered in time, though none escaped the marks of their lineage. Some tried to pass quietly into other valleys, carrying new names, but their faces always betrayed them. Others never left Dead Hollow at all, bound by the weight of a story too heavy to shed. Generations later, ruins of the O'Dell cabin still stood, its door sagging, its windows black and hollow, a monument to silence. The legend of the widow's children became Appalachia's most hidden tale, not because no one knew it, but because everyone chose to look away. The ruins of the O'Dell cabin still stood, its door sagging, its windows black and hollow, a monument to silence.